Hello, I'm Zack Stanton.
And I'm Adam Wren.
It's Friday, May 23rd, and this is the Playbook Podcast. First, let's preview 3 stories driving the day. The first story driving Washington's conversation today is, yes, the one big beautiful bill has passed the House after some heavy holdout arm twisting from President Donald Trump. But now it faces an uncertain future in the U.S. Senate. The fight over the legislation is now having a secondary effect, signaling the beginning of 2026 midterm fights. House Republicans in precarious districts may soon be in danger due to the package's Medicaid clawbacks. Plus, some in the populist wing of the GOP, like economist Orrin Cass, are warning that the bill is a total mess, mixing old-school conservative policies and an extension of the 2017 Trump tax cuts that will add to the deficit despite efforts to curb Medicaid and food stamp spending. The second story you'll surely need to know today is that Washington is still reeling after 2 Israeli embassy staffers, Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, were shot and killed while leaving an event at the Capitol Jewish Museum on Wednesday night. Janine Pirro, the interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, said that the shooting is being investigated as a hate crime and as terrorism. And the third thing and biggest topic of the day is that it's probably safe to say that President Donald Trump's revenge tour has fully begun. Adam, we're seeing a multi-pronged rollout here that has intensified over the last couple days. We see that the administration is blocking Harvard now from enrolling international students, and is forcing existing ones at the university to transfer or else risk losing their legal status. We see the Federal Trade Commission going after Media Matters over their work on Elon Musk and his X, or formerly known as Twitter, platform content and allegations that maybe it was conspiring to deprive it of advertising revenue. We have the Department of Justice investigating ActBlue, the Democratic fundraising powerhouse, for alleged use of straw donors and foreign contributions in domestic elections. We see interim U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Alina Habba, bringing down the hammer on Democratic lawmakers who were present at recent ICE protests in Newark. And Trump continues to push back against the Supreme Court, despite insistence that he will obey their rulings. What is going on here?
Yeah, Zach, we are seeing a concerted, broadly pronged effort to attack a lot of elite institutions. And I think, broadly speaking, the polling is on Donald Trump's side in a lot of these cases. I mean, even Democrats have said earlier this year at a conference that I've reported on that elite institutions of higher education are not exactly the most popular places among broad swaths of the electorate. But it's remarkable and just how many different investigations or targets that have been added just to Donald Trump's plate this week. I mean, Bruce Springsteen, ActBlue, Media Matters, any number of liberal targets are on his plate. And I thought it was interesting to hear former Vice President Mike Pence in his interview with Kristen Welker at NBC's Meet the Press sort of describe his frustration with Donald Trump's backward-looking approach. He described it as looking in the rearview mirror. And in a lot of ways, you wonder if the average Trump voter, wants all these things to happen, even though some of these institutions poll poorly.
Well, I think it's probably the real difference between the sort of general election type message and reaching out to maybe voters who don't pay that close attention to politics versus this seeming like a real play for the base, and it's red meat for the MAGA faithful in many ways. And the Pence comments were interesting because this is a real difference from the first Trump administration, where Trump had certain guardrails, for lack of a better term, where there were people within the administration who were sort of hemming him in and preventing him from potentially bigger excesses. And nowadays, anyone who's in the administration is really along for the ride at this point. And it's curious to see how this is going to play out. I think that the court battles are one thing in particular that I'm going to be watching, especially as we see in recent months, or even this past week, J.D. Vance in his interview with Ross Douthat from the New York Times suggesting that the Supreme Court is really misunderstanding what its role is. He specifically called out something that Chief Justice John Roberts said, where Roberts had said that part of the role of the court is to prevent the executive branch from its excesses. And Vance really pushed back on that. Last year, Vance appeared on This Week with George Stephanopoulos and said that the president basically could ignore a Supreme Court ruling because the court doesn't really have much of an enforcement mechanism if it were to be ignored. How do we see this shaking out from this point on?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting this week to kind of observe two developments or tensions. We learned on Thursday that Trump essentially has $600 million in a war chest ahead of the midterms already to litigate the opening years of his second administration. And so a lot of these things we're talking about are already base activation efforts. As you alluded to just now, these are sort of beyond general election talking points, and they're designed to get out, to turn out the president's base in a midterm year. We know next year, we know from our own columnist, Rachel Bade, that Trump is obsessed with the midterms, that he really wants to not be a lame duck and win back Congress and keep both the House and Senate and the Republican ledger, which is going to be increasingly difficult. And so we're already seeing him doing some of those base turnout efforts. And then I thought, when you saw the big, beautiful bill get passed this week, it was interesting how quickly battle lines were drawn. You had the Democrats, the DCCC sort of saying any Republican in a battleground district who voted for this bill is already at risk of losing next year, and Republicans sort of doubling down on their priorities. It's this weird amalgam of cobbling together the first administration under Trump, the tax bill, renewing those tax cuts, and then also having these sort of MAGA America First priorities. I thought that Ian Ward in Politico magazine really got at this tension well in his interview with Orrin Cass at kind of the mess this big, beautiful bill really is, and how it's sort of cobbling together in a way that even Trump's proponents don't see as like the most beneficial thing is happening.
Yeah, and there are real questions about the long-term effects of all of this, which Wall Street has just begun to react to and the bond market is reacting to, because while this ostensibly does cut government in the sense of reducing spending on things like Medicaid or on food stamps, it is exploding the federal deficit because you're decreasing taxes, decreasing revenue to an extreme amount, even as you keep spending quite high. And that's going to be one of the roadblocks that it really runs into in the Senate, where folks like Ron Johnson are pointing to the deficit impact of this legislation as a real no-go for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Much has been made of the big tent that Trump assembled in November of 2024 to win re-election. And in some ways, we're seeing that big tent fold in on itself. I mean, Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, and Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, these are people who in some ways represent sort of the old fiscal conservatism, even if Ron Johnson sometimes dabbles in MAGA-based conspiracies. Like, they really care about these issues of getting the deficit down, avoiding spending in the red. And they're upset about this big, beautiful bill, and they have concerns about it in the Senate. And so it'll be interesting to watch as this big tent folds in on itself.
Yeah, and one of the central questions there is, what is it that animates today's Republican Party? What is it that unites it? And the Republican Party, for such a long time, was not a big tent coalition. It was an ideological coalition. The Democrats were more the big tent party in some sense, and that created all sorts of liabilities in terms of finding common ground, ways to bring everyone together and keep them on the same page. Now, the Democratic Party still has many of those same issues, but the Republican Party has moved from something now that is more ideological based and much more about conservatism to something that is much more about trying to figure out what pleases Donald Trump, what will be good for MAGA. And I think that that's part of what's animating all the actions that the administration is taking when we're looking at the war that they've sort of quietly committed to on things like Media Matters, on things like Act Blue, on Democratic lawmakers. It's really about trying to peel back all the centers of Democratic power or any real footholds that they have in institutions in order to weaken those institutions and create a more long-term victory for MAGA conservatism.
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive, Zach. It's fascinating to see how the parties become less ideological and more identitarian. You see someone like Representative Victoria Spartz of Indiana, who said at one of her town halls just a few weeks ago that she would never vote for a bill like this that increased the deficit. And of course, she voted for the bill this time. And while she said that it has a lot of problems, it needs fixed in a lot of different ways, she backed it. And it broke a lot of the pledges that she had made to her own constituents. But I thought our colleague Jonathan Martin was very perceptive this week on X. As people were sort of spiking the football on behalf of Speaker Mike Johnson, he got this done again. We're seeing a lot of laser eye gifs, a lot of laser eye memes. Mike Johnson always wins. Of course he won. Like Donald Trump, the president who has a vice grip on his own party, went to Capitol Hill and told Republicans to vote for this bill. And if they didn't, they risked a primary. And so Republicans got in line, and in some cases they compromised their own stated values and they backed this bill. And here we are.
What is it that you're going to be watching here as the conversation goes from the House to the Senate? Beyond, Rand Paul, Ron Johnson, are there particular disagreements? Are there particular policy areas that you think are really going to be hurdles here?
I think as it heads to the quote unquote cooling saucer, there's going to be significant haggling and stripping some of the measures of this bill. Like, is the Republican led Senate willing to eat some of these cuts to Medicaid that we've seen? I think that could hurt their own constituencies ahead of what once looked like a pretty easy skate for Republicans to retain the Senate. There are states like Texas, North Carolina, where inter-party squabbles and primaries could pull their efforts back to re-win those seats with Democrats in the general election. So to what extent they're willing to eat those, I'm fascinated to see.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for this morning, but as always, we try to end the show with something lighthearted from the Playbook newsletter. And we have a fun one today. Alex Moore, a top staffer for Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, will be on the next season of Survivor. Surely marathon days like the past 48 hours in the House have prepared him for whatever Jeff Probst has in store. So if you have items for Playbook, send us your tips, birthdays, or spotted moments to playbook@politico.com. Adam, thanks. This was great.
Good to be with you, Zach, always.
And that's all for today's Playbook podcast. We have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. We'll be back on Tuesday. Have a great Memorial Day.